Couple of programming notes. Number one, I recorded this podcast while the Shadow City Kickstarter was ongoing, but failed to get it out in time. I apologize for that. Number two, the Temple of Elemental Evil giveaway winner is Joe Bradshaw 8515. Email me on the back end of my channel so that we can make those arrangements. Third, I am now a drive-through RPG affiliate. You're going to start to see links in my description. So if you're looking for the products that I review or talk about, just click on that link for me and order it through there. I would greatly appreciate it. It really helped me out. Thanks. On to the show. Today, I am bringing you a special interview of a RPG designer that I have been following lately for one of my favorite RPGs, Shadow Dark. So I'm going to let him have the opportunity to introduce himself. So, sir, thank you for coming to my podcast. And who are you?
Oh, my name is Greg Christopher, but 12, 13 years ago, I started using Chubby Funster as my trade name, and it just stuck. People like saying it, like it's a fun name, and so it's taken off. I think a lot of people know me more as Chubby Funster than as Greg, but I'm fine with that because there's other Gregs in the hobby. Big old school role-playing game guy. I've written a large number of supplements for Shadow Dark. I think it's over 12. Started out converting some stuff from the work I had done before Shadow Dark came out,
Yeah,
and then I've just kept building from there. And it's just
yeah.
been really great ride with Shadow Dark. And I also have a couple products for some other systems. Yeah, but it's just Shadow Dark is what I'm most well known for.
Yeah, and thank you for coming on the podcast. We'll get a chance to talk about all of that stuff as we go because I've been a little bit familiar with your work prior to your Shadow Dark work. But first, I would like to know, Greg, how did you get into hobby gaming? Tell me your RPG origin story per se.
Well, when I was a kid, I went to this camp where you only saw your parents like twice for a 6 week period. Otherwise, it was a really intense wilderness camp, and they had no phones, no TVs, no video games, nothing. And I got into a lot of my kind of adult nerding stuff then. I started reading a bunch of Star Wars books at that time. Really, the extended universe of Star Wars really got me into that. And I hadn't ever heard of role-playing games before I started going to this camp. And I heard that there were these kids who were playing some kind of game. And I went over to where they were, and they were playing Rifts, which was a little bit outside of my capacity at that time. Rifts is a pretty powerhouse thing for a 13-year-old or so, whatever I was, and but it introduced me to the idea of what a role playing game is, of seeing these guys play Rifts, and then I met through them a couple kids who played second edition D&D, and that became second edition D&D was my big role playing game for most of my teen years. I loved it. I remember in high school going to the chess club and I would play a couple games of chess, and then there was this guy there, and we would sit there and just trade the two ebooks that we had around the table, and like I would give him skills and powers, and he would give me, the Crusades or the Complete Fighter or whatever, and we would just read these second edition books. And second edition was huge for me. So that was from there. It evolved into as I've always been an old school kind of philosophy. So,
Right.
but
And
yeah, second
can I
edition
ask
is
you?
where it is.
Can I
Yeah.
can I ask you a second edition? Okay, so second edition is known for having these great supplements. I mean, fantastic. Those, the soft cover brown books. Did you get into any of those?
At the time, not really. I had a box set for Undermountain, and I had a couple other Forgotten Realms things, and that was really my focus. Was in Forgotten Realms for a long time, and it wasn't until I was in my 20s or maybe even 30s that I ever even read about some of the other settings, like Dark Sun or Al-Qadim or anything like that. I did read a lot of the green books. They were it's kind of the same books, I think, just different printings. Yeah, and it had the gold font on the front.
Yeah, yeah,
Those were the
exactly.
best.
Yeah.
They were so good. Yeah.
Fantastic. Yeah. So, folks, I'm pretty sure there's like PDFs of a lot of them on DM's Guild. Yeah. So
A lot
if
of them are
you
on
go,
drive through too. Yeah,
okay,
that's
all right, you're
DM's
on drive. Okay.
PDFs. Yeah.
Okay, yeah. So go check those out because there's a lot of because it wasn't just about like game mechanics. It was mostly just historical stuff, like lots of well researched topics on Vikings and Celtic culture and all that kind of stuff. So cool, cool. So second edition was your first version of D&D that you played, and you said that you're into kind of the old school style of play. What is it about that style of play that you love?
The main thing for me is that the game's kind of success or failure, your character's life is not based on what powers you have per se, but how you use your brain as a player to solve the problem. So, like one of the things I'm kind of famous for in the community is equipment. I make tons and tons and tons of equipment lists for stuff that was in my OSR game that I wrote, Ambition and Avarice, and then I converted into Shadow Dark. And I've always wanted a ton of equipment, not just like for the players to buy, but for the players to receive as treasure all the time. You know, go into a room and there's a whole bunch of stuff that you can take with you that might not seem even that important, like a bowl or a candlestick or something, but this it by giving players all of these objects, they start to come up with ways that they can solve problems that are not things on their character sheet. The thing that I really dislike about the way modern D&D has gone, and this, I played a lot of third edition, and at the time I kind of didn't see a problem with things that I would criticize today. But when it switched over to fourth edition, I really saw the direction that they were going. And even though they pulled it back a little bit when they went into fifth, it's still like the curtain has been pulled back and I saw the situation. It's like, okay, they want you to play this game like a tactical game where you just have powers and I'm going to move here and I'm going to use this power and then I'm going to move there and I'm going to use that power and you're interacting with it like it's a video game. And what I've always loved about role-playing games is that you can use your brain to solve any problem. You don't have to just treat it like a video game. You can come up with unique solutions and the GM can decide whether they work or not, but you always have that flexibility. And I felt like the direction that D&D kept going in was like, here's a list of special magic things that you can do. Even if it's, a fighter, they're almost like magical powers that are activated and used like a magic item or something. And I've always liked the idea of like your character's good at these general categories, and then the player goes, okay, well, I'm going to try to use these objects in the environment to make an improvised solution to this situation. And I don't think that that's the way that modern D&D players want to go at all. And that is really the defining point to me, in how they interact with the world itself.
Right, you're right, and I've definitely noticed that, and I think kind of similar as you, like going into third edition, I was excited about those options, and then going into fourth edition, I was kind of excited about those options, and then soured on it, and then fifth edition was cool, and then after having played fifth edition for 10 years, it's like that style that I learned how to play initially, that's pretty good.
Yeah.
So you got into hobby gaming in second edition and everything like that. And at some point you decided that you wanted to do RPG design. When did you start first designing RPGs? Talk about some of your work here. And why do you like design? Because you have to like it at least a little bit to keep doing it, right?
I would agree. Yeah. Well, the thing is, I was designing stuff before I started designing role-playing games. It was just in the form of video game mods. So I've always been a huge video gamer, and I did a ton with video game mods. Yeah, Neverwinter Nights was one of the games that I love to mod, the first one. And I made tons and tons of mods, but the problem with making video game mods is that time marches on. And even if you are still passionate about it yourself, the video games have moved on. You know, the players that might be interested in your mod are no longer playing the game that you wrote the mod for. So I kind of came to a point where I was like, look, if I'm gonna be spending a significant amount of time every week making these things, it should be on some kind of chassis that I can control, that it's mine. And I can say, no, we're not going to make the next Fallout game. We're not going to make Neverwinter Nights 2. We're not going to do what, like it's going to be, this way that Greg wants. And so I've always been just every week having a huge amount of creative output. So I've just kind of decided that role-playing games is where I want to put that energy. And
Okay.
so I started writing free games because I knew how to do layout even 12, 13 years ago when I got started because I learned it for work. But I didn't have the budget to afford art. I didn't have the ability to do a lot of stuff. And I didn't have any reputation in the market. So I wrote about 6 or 7 free games on the premise of getting art that it was going to be free so I could get donated art from all sorts of artists. So they would say, yeah, I'll give you permission to use this piece. And I got a lot of really great color art that way. But the games just weren't that great. No, I don't know of anybody who sits down to write their first thing and it's just spectacular. One of the most incredible factoids I've heard in playing the kind of old school way is that the Caverns of Thracia was written when Jaquays was like 25 or something. And I'm like, it's unbelievable, like that somebody that young would have developed their skills that quickly. Like the things that really amaze me is people who have mastered a very difficult skill at a young age like that. And it took me a while to get better and figure out my path, and then Ambition and Avarice
Yeah.
was my first like paid game that I released, and that's still up on drive through.
Right. And now that you mentioned that, my next question was what other RPGs or hobby gaming work have you done aside from Shadow Dark? And I knew that Ambitions and Avarice was the big one. So let's talk about that.
Yeah, so Ambition and Avarice is OSR game where the idea is that the character classes are not like glamorous heroes. They're all, and that's kind of like in the title, like they're people who are greedy and off the beaten path. Yeah, they're not paladins. They're not druids. They're not heroes. And the classes are things like brigands and cultists and savages and zealots. But people that are, you're not just a cleric. You're like a really incredibly passionate zealot. So you don't fit in with the regular people back in town. And those are the kind of people who go out into a cavern that's full of monsters, is my thought process. And so I created for those classes what I think are a bunch of really cool ideas for how character classes should work. And I created a whole bunch of magic spells that were utility. I have about like in the traditional D&D balance, there's maybe, 20% of spells are direct damage, and then maybe 50% of them are kind of status effects. And then the ones that are actually utilities at most, and depending on what it is like 30%. But I wrote the spells for Ambition and Avarice with the idea of like maybe half of them or more are utilities, like what I was talking about equipment. Like the idea is you have all these spells that do really weird things. Like you can touch a column and it turns a stone column and it weakens it and turns it into like sand. Not sand is too far. I forget the exact description, but it starts to crack. So if it's a load bearing column, it will cause a thing to collapse. And you say, well, that doesn't sound that powerful necessarily until you put it in the hands of clever players who are going to go running around finding everything under the sun to cause to collapse. And then you go, oh, okay, that's really, so I created spells that I thought would give even more of that creative ability to the players. How many uses can you find for with a paper clip is the example. So I give them a lot of paper clips. How many what can you make out of all these things? And that was the focus for Ambition and Avarice, and it was successful in a small publisher sense, but nowhere near as successful as Shadowdark. And so when Shadowdark came along, I took a lot of the ideas, the spells, the equipment, the stuff that's in Ambition Avarice, and I started converting it into Shadowdark. And that was when things really took off.
Right. So why did you decide to design for Shadowdark? What was it about this game?
Well, in the early days, when it was still kickstarting and the numbers were just going off the charts, and I'm friends with a guy named Eric Tenkar, and he runs a very popular live streams, and I knew him back when his blog was just getting started, and Tenkar's Tavern blog, and he said, this Kickstarter's going really great, guys. The quick start rules are out. Let's get together on a live stream and we'll just play a session, right?
Yeah,
And
I remember I watched it.
yeah, and it was fun. It was good. I think looking back now, what I'd say is that the design is kind of in the center of the bell curve. There's the things that are in the game appeal to the broadest possible array of people.
Yes,
So if you could make a game that does a very specific thing and can be very cool, Adventure Conquer King, 1 and 2, I would say that
yes.
about. They're
Yep.
fantastic games, but they have certain elements about them that do not appeal to the public as well as many of the elements in Shadowdark. And, a lot of people in the hobby that are independents like me, or Alexander McCrease or anybody out there, right, making their own stuff, they kind of have this natural dislike towards mainstream D&D community because they want something special outside of that, right? So they have a tendency to say, this game that they made sucks, and this adventure they made sucks, and I'm doing something cooler than that, and I'm doing this. I get it. That's part of. I say terrible things about Wizards of the Coast all the time. But there is something to be said for having things like that are in fifth edition that appeal to a lot of people that are playing the game. So, you could make the greatest dessert or some other specialty thing that appeals to a limited number of people. And you can be like, this dessert is just amazing, and regular people just don't even know what they're missing. But there's something to be said for having food that everybody likes, even if you think it's, lowbrow or whatever diminutive statement that people make about it. So I'm not personally, until I played Shadowdark, I really didn't see any great appeal in advantage and disadvantage. I still don't think it's like the greatest thing ever. But there are a lot of people who just really prefer it. They want it way more than going into a situation where they have to keep track of a whole bunch of little modifiers, like in third edition, fourth edition. And so, even though I personally might not be like, I'm only going to play the game if it has, this or that feature, I play tons of different games. There's a lot of people that are like, I only want to play a game if it works the way I want. And a lot of people have those characteristics wrapped up in Shadowdark, and I think that's why it has been as incredibly successful as it has been. Kelsey didn't invent that many things that were like brand new things that she just pulled out and was like, here's my new great innovation. A huge part of the innovation was assembling the ingredients correctly, and I think that's what she's done.
True. Okay, so you get contacted by Tenkar about Shadowdark Kickstarter being exploding, and the quick start coming out, and you guys ended up, playing a couple of live stream sessions of it, which were highly entertaining, folks, because it was just a bunch of guys playing a game. It just happened to be for everybody else to see. So you put out a couple of supplements. I think the first thing you put out was an equipment guide.
Expanded equipment and
Expanded equipment.
expanded character options. Yeah.
Yes. And so I grabbed both of those as soon as they were out because I'm sure wasn't the only one starving for like Shadow Dark options, which is kind of odd to really say, right? Like, 'cause you got this OSR style game, which typically has like a minimalist aesthetic. There's stuff that people like.
That's right. Yeah. That was my thought was I wanted to build things that people could just take if they wanted to add onto the base chassis. It wasn't like I'm replacing what's in Shadow Dark as much as just saying, here's a whole bunch of extra stuff you can put in there. So like the ancestries, there's 6 ancestries in base Shadow Dark, and I said, what if there were 24 ancestry? And I added all the kind of ancestries that people like, like drow and having a difference between like a high elf and a gray elf and
Yeah.
things like that, and different types of dwarves and different types of halflings and stuff, and adding like what would be if you were an orc and you were a player character, and what would it be if this, and just adding out, expanding it. That's hence the names. And a lot of the stuff that was in the equipment one came from Ambition and Avarice. And a lot of the classes and races were stuff that just was, I was familiar with already in the hobby. And you just write, this is what it would be like if they were for Shadow Dark. And people really took to it.
For sure. That became a thing, right? I was familiar with you, at least passingly familiar about Ambitions and Avarice and everything like that. So you do those books. You also wrote some other things. You wrote like a GM's guide to old school gaming and a couple of adventures from what I recall
Yep.
in
And
the early days.
there was a magic book of like, I released a
Yes.
magic book when we only had the quick start. And so the quick start only had first and second level. So it was just a whole bunch of extra first and second level spells. And my thought was, how many people get to the point where they're even casting third level spells? So this should be pretty good for a while. So I released that, and that was probably the least successful of the three in terms of adding to the core book. But still, I mean, I think it's an Electrum product. Still pretty good. It was just I kept doing that, and then I started releasing settings. Like I released Shadow Sun was the first one, and it was a conversion of Dark Sun, and then changing a lot of the aesthetic to match into the Shadow Dark aesthetic. So it kind of blended the two, and having like, instead of just a silt sea, having the sea be actually black silt like Shadow Dark, so that it created these like black oceans and all kinds of ways of bringing in the ideas from Shadow Dark in there. And I tried to avoid having any IP issues with Wizards, stuff like that. And that was my first product that took off to a huge height, was the Shadow Sun. It's a platinum
Yeah.
now and on its way to mithril.
Wow. And there was another setting that you released that was Shadow Rim. You did something a little different with that. Let's talk about that.
Yeah, so Shadow Rim, I've Skyrim has been my favorite role-playing game on computer for a long, long time. And I love the Nordic setting. I love all of the detail and the cultures stuff that's in there. And so I haven't ever been happy with any of the branded stuff that's come out for Skyrim. And so I said, well, how would a classless Elder Scrolls type character advancement work under Shadow Dark type system? And in Skyrim, your levels and all your skills and stuff go up through a constellation system where you pick a constellation when you level up, and you like ignite one of the stars in the constellation, and that becomes your perk for that level. And so I designed, I think it's 9 constellations with all of these stars in them that are the talents in Shadow Dark. When you level up, you roll 2d6 to determine your talent for the next level, and well, every other level. But I had it in Shadowrim as every level you're rolling on for a new star. And so I thought that was really, cool way of bringing the feel of Skyrim into Shadowdark. And then I developed a alchemy system where in Skyrim, I think anybody who's played Skyrim's done a ton of alchemy, and you can find these alchemical ingredients around in the game. And when you taste one of them, you get like the first power that it has. And then you have to just experiment or find recipes to figure out the other things that the ingredient can do. So when you combine those ingredients, you can make potions of that ability. So if you have two ingredients that can create invisibility, then that's how you make an invisibility potion. The problem is that it's fixed. So everybody goes on the Skyrim wiki now, and you can just look up what all of the powers were. And I didn't want that to happen in a role-playing game to have it already written in the book. So I made it so that when you find an alchemical ingredient, you roll randomly off of a table, and it's every time the only way to figure out what they do is through experimentation or finding somebody an NPC in the game that knows what it is. And so that I feel real. People have said that they feel like this is like really brings the way of making potions in Sky. Makes it feel like you're playing Skyrim for the first time again. What does this hawk feather do? Well, I don't know. I'm gonna go. I'm gonna experiment and try to make a potion. And I did a similar thing for enchanting, where you can capture souls just like in Skyrim with a soul trap, and then you use them. But in Shadowdark, there's a random magic item creation system where you're rolling off of tables to give a magic item like a benefit and a drawback. And so I made it so that depending on the combination of souls that you have, you could have a benefit with no drawback, or a benefit and a drawback, or there's some other things ways that you can make it different. So it really puts the magic item creation in the hands of the players if they work hard for it. So I tried to bring in all the kind of the feeling of playing Skyrim into the system, and people have said that it's really, they really enjoyed playing it. I've had a bunch of people tell me that they've had some great successes at their home tables with it. Shadowrim's probably like my secret favorite kid out of all of the things because I just love Skyrim so much.
It reads great. I could never have had an opportunity to play it, but I gotta go back and try it. So maybe I'll play it on the channel. We'll see.
That'd be awesome.
Yeah. Folks listening to this, let me know if you really want solo play here on the channel. Because I put something up a little bit ago. It didn't seem like there was much interest, but if that's something you want to see, please let me know. So you've done some expanded options. You bundled those options up into the player's option book and the GM's option book. So you don't have to buy these things piecemeal, which is great. And you've done a couple of settings, and now, as we speak, you have a Kickstarter going for another Shadowdark setting, Shadow City.
Yep. Blood and Neon. Yeah, it's a vampire adaptation of the Shadowdark system. So it's its own freestanding game. It doesn't require Shadowdark to play, but it's massively inspired by Shadowdark. And it has its own set of attributes. It has its own character classes for being a vampire. The kind of ancestry equivalent is a bloodline, which is like what you biologically are inheriting from the person who turned you into a vampire. And then the classes are kind of what you're making of yourself in being a vampire. And they range from like you're spending your time learning technical skills to interacting with people to being kind of a sneaky thief type. Um, and all those things are backed up with supernatural abilities rather than just, I like to sneak around. Instead, I can bend the shadows around me like a blanket. And a lot of it is inspired from Vampire the Masquerade as well, but it does not have any of the lore or any of the clan backgrounds like in Vampire the Masquerade. And the focus of the game is on playing in like a vampire setting with an OSR with an old school feel. So when you make the start of the game, you make the city randomly. There's a system for rolling up all the neighborhoods of the city and drawing them out on a hex map. And then there's a system for populating those neighborhoods with points of interest. And there's a system for randomly building them out like dungeons. So you roll up that you've got a hospital here, and then you roll some dice and figure out how many floors are in the hospital, how far out do they extend, and then you draw this node mapping system to represent that, where there's kind of a central tree that is the nodes that control access through things. So whether it's a big lobby or a tight hallway or something like that, and then you build branches off of those to kind of represent space within the building. And you can connect the first and the last node to make a circle if you had like a park that was outdoors or had like a circular track shape, or you could change the orientation of it however you need, but I wanted it to be something you could draw on a piece of paper. So you could just like a dungeon on a piece of graph paper, you can draw whatever you want and build your own unique space, but you can build it very, very quickly, just like you can in D&D. You don't have to go get a map. You don't have to come up with, a realistic looking map of some huge office building or something. You can just draw it out as a set of related nodes, and then it's just okay. Well, you're leaving the research lab part of the hospital, and you're moving into the maintenance area or whatever. Like it's abstract, so you don't. Modern spaces are so huge. The idea of drawing a 5 foot per square uh, full map for a modern stadium or police station or something like it's huge, huge spaces. So the systems are designed to give you that same feel like when you're playing an old school game, but you're in the vampire setting. And for anybody who's never played Vampire the Masquerade or similar systems, they're very complex. It's kind of like the difference between third edition D&D and first edition D&D. So I'm more interested in it being as simple as possible. That's why I like Shadow Dark in the first place.
All right. I like this approach because I only have like one or two sessions of Vampire the Masquerade experience. And I know that this seems like a system that will actually enable you to get into the role playing more, which is kind of like the big appeal for those types of games.
That
So
was my it's like I said about equipment. Like I want you to be put in situations where you're like, how can we get through this physical space? How can we interact with these people? How can we do this thing physically? Not which one of my magic powers can I use to solve this problem? It's most things you can do without using your vampire powers. You could try to so you guys using your vampire powers could draw a lot of attention. And the game has in Shadow Dark, there's like a torch mechanic that keeps people on their toes, and they're always under time pressure with the torch. And in Shadow City, the time pressure is people. So there's always people go. So the fewer vampire powers you can use, the less attention you're going to attract from all these people that are trying to be like, what is that guy doing over there? And if you turn into a bat, they're going to really figure out quick that something's up. Come check it out. But if you're just a guy with a crowbar, they might be like, oh, it's no big deal. So I feel that for years, the vampire setting for, all of its intricacy was just locked behind a system barrier that was very, very complex. And I want to bring it out into the open and be accessible for a quick, you can sit down, you can play a one shot, learn your character in 5 to 10 minutes and go. Not let me give you a half-hour lecture on how the dice mechanics work. It's just a simple approach that you can teach
So
anybody in a minute.
so true. So between the city node system, I caught a little bit of another interview that you did. You talked about the consequences of exposing people to the supernatural powers.
Yep.
For this setting, it sounds amazing.
Thank you.
Yeah, tell people how that worked.
Okay, so the game has an apocalypse timer. So in a lot of vampire stories, not just Vampire the Masquerade, there's this idea that like the end times are close. And the idea in this game is that the end time is the humans figuring out that you're real. You know, you guys have spent centuries making them think that there's nothing out there, and their technology keeps improving to the point where eventually they have, you know, infrared cameras are everywhere and drones and all this stuff, and the humans will figure out that are really a vampire. And so the game has a 10-point apocalypse timer, and every 5 years you get 1 point. So the game starts in 1981, and if you just every 5 years gain a point, then in 2031 it's over. But you probably won't get there because every time a sufficient number of people are exposed to something that you did wrong, the apocalypse timer also bumps up one. So every vampire has kind of this incentive to make sure that whatever happens in Vegas stays in Vegas, you know, and they have to just kill anybody who figures out some truth about vampirism. And so every time the players are doing something like the equivalent of like the torch mishap in Shadow Dark, a torch blows out, the wind comes and blows it out, or you drop it, or there's some water and the torch goes out. You know, there's occasionally the GM's making rolls and like you're in the middle of doing something and like a guy comes around the corner. The cops get called for a domestic dispute next door. You know, something happens and all of a sudden like you're having to cover everything up really quickly. And if you don't, every time you go to sleep in the morning, I always have to be careful. I want to say when you go to sleep at night, but you're not going to sleep at night. When you go to sleep in the morning, when you wake back up, twice as many people will have been aware of it as when you went to sleep. So every day it will just keep expanding out until eventually, I think it's 1,000 people or something. When it gets over a certain point, there's just no stopping, and you lose a point on the apocalypse timer. And that's a big loss, you know, because that's 5 years of vampire time. If you start doing things that are risky, then the other NPC vampires in the world are going to want to come kill you and stop you being a problem. So not only are you screwing up your own life in a sense, you know, you're creating problems for these other guys who are much bigger and more powerful than you. And so it's kind of like if you were in D&D and D and every time you screwed up, like fifth level, seventh level adventurers come and try to kill you. So it gets really exciting of, you know, how are you going to handle these situations? It feels like, you know, a lot more like the Black Lodge Games guys call it like a mafia game. Like you're trying to maintain this level of secrecy from the police, the man, whatever. Yeah, you've got to stay in hiding, or else you're toast. You can't fight a city of 5 million people, 20 million people. You have to hide. That's your only choice.
Sounds really, really cool. So, Greg, what is coming down the line for you and for Chubby Funster Games?
I have, as I mentioned both of them earlier, I'm a big fan of Dark Sun and Al Qadim. And I made Shadow Sun with a big inspiration from Dark Sun. And Al Qadim is a little bit trickier because it's Al Qadim is really focused on Arabia, and I am a history buff in the extreme, and so I'm fan of a lot bigger cultural spread than just Arabia. You know, I'm I know a lot of stuff about Persia and Mesopotamia and Egypt and Cordoba and when this Islamic presence was in Spain or the extent of Islam in northern India and so on. So I'm been working on a setting for a while. I work on a lot of projects, kind of low level for a while, just to make sure I work out all the ideas. There's a long time when I'm like, I don't know how I do this or that, and it just stays in an outline form. But I've got money coming in now that allows me to get custom commissioned art, which is very difficult. Anybody who's tried to do this, or if you start drifting outside of the areas that have good stock art, it can be very, very pricey because there's very few Arabian looking fantasy stock art pieces. There's almost none that look like they're from medieval Cordoba or Persia or the Turks that lived north of the Caspian Sea. Like it's just not there. Um, One of the artists that I commissioned to do some stuff, I saw him post on Facebook how it was the first time he had ever had to draw someone from the Himalayas in a stock art piece, and he was happy about it. Like so, it's just stuff like that where you just don't exist. So now I have the money now to back those kind of things, and I'm building it out. It's going to have it has a huge map that I already made that's 99 by 99 hex map, similar size to. I have a setting for Acts 2 called Warlords of Gavardia. Has a similar size map. It's a huge map, big giant poster map, bigger than like the Forgotten Realms. And I'm building it out now with Ernest now that Shadow City's finished, and it just keeps going. I'm finding things from cultures that I'm really a fan of historically. Pulling in like the ruins in this place look like they're from Indonesia, so I send some pictures of very different type of structures than the artist is used to drawing, and I'm like, this is what I want it to look like in the background of this guy. I'm having a lot of boats that are very different from the boats that a lot of almost all the boats that are in medieval fantasy art are Viking longships. Those that aren't are basically like cogs, if you're familiar with them, or just galleys. And the Islamic world had tons of different boats, dhows and Badens, and there's boats that are exclusive to the Horn of Africa or to the Persian Gulf. And so putting that kind of stuff together, it takes time, it takes money, but this is going to be a two-book set. The name of the game, I should probably said that earlier, is going to be Kharazim, Kharizim. The player book is going to be kind of character creation, equipment, spells, and then a gazetteer of all the different places that the person already knows about in the game. So it'll give the players all kinds of hooks that they could say, I'd like to go to this place or that place. And then the GM book is going to be the monsters and the back end stuff, but it's going to have the randomization systems like in Shadow City for the GM to build out anything that they need. So the GM doesn't have to care where the players pick in the gazetteer to go, right? The GM can just build whatever they need when the players get there.
That sounds interesting as well. Can't wait to see that come together. Yeah.
We're still a long ways off,
I
but
know.
yeah, but I'm happy to be working on it. It's been great.
Yeah. Yeah. And I'm sure you'll have other smaller projects that come together between now and then, as typically your workflow goes.
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah.
I
So
I work on tons of things at once, so whenever I get kind of inspired by something, I can go work on that and do what I'm doing. Then when feel inspired for a different part of a different product, I go work on that. And I'm always want to be working on something that I really actually want to do. I don't want to get into a situation where I'm like working for slaving away to make a book I don't care about. I want it always to be something I'm really interested in getting out of my head.
probably a great way to go about it. I hear that the greatest challenge for RPG designers is the grind. They get to a point where they have to finish, right? And it
Yeah.
just gets tough sometimes. But it sounds like you don't really have that problem.
No, I work on kind of 4 or 5 things at a low level and then one like main thing. So
Yeah.
yeah, when the main thing gets done, I switch over to another thing that I've been thinking about for a while and I care about. You know, I started working on Karzim over a year and a half ago, I think was when I made the map. So it's something that builds up over time.
Right. Well, Greg, thanks for being on the podcast. I have one final question that I ask all my guests that come on. So, Greg, what is one interesting thing about you that people may not know about?
I thought about how to answer this, and I guess the way is I come from a bunch of unique, weird kind of background influences. I both of my parents were actuaries, and I went into insurance when I was in my 20s after I left college. So I have all of that kind of mathematical approach to the world. You know that there are predictable things about the world, and you can put together. I think that's how I feel about random tables. That random tables are just kind of like the odds of you running into any particular thing at any particular time, kind of like an actuarial table about when you're going to get into a car accident. And then I went to school for political science, and I got well, my focus was on political economy, and I learned kind of all sorts of theoretical things there, writing skills there, research skills there. My personal interest in history has been the dominating force in my life. And then my day job and my for over 10 years now has been doing instructional design. I never ended up pursuing things in my in my degree path. And so I make every day things to teach people how to do things. And so all of those influence put together, I think, have made me into the creator that I am in the role-playing game space. A lot of times people think that every person comes from just, you know, like, oh, that guy grew up in this way. And most people don't really understand all of the factors that are affecting anybody. And the things that have affected me have turned me into a person who likes to create fantasy worlds that make sense to me, ends up being really deep and new to somebody when they experience it. So I think that's all those things have factored in. And I like to ask people about their own backgrounds to get that kind of detail on what made them into the person that they are.
Fascinating. I guess I wasn't expecting like actuarial exposure, I guess. But yeah, you're absolutely right. You have these variety of experiences and background stuff and everything like that, and that leads you to the person that you are and hobbies and interests that you have. So cool. So I've thanked you a couple of times, but once again, thank you for coming onto my podcast. And where can people find you, Greg?
Um, I do almost all of my kind of talking on X on Twitter. You just look up Chubby Funster. My drive-through stuff is all on my profile page at drive-through. I've been growing on Facebook. I had been using Facebook for a long time just for personal stuff, but I cut ties with a lot of the things from family and people from work and so on, and I just converted it into a publisher kind of thing recently. So I am on Facebook under Greg Christopher. And I'm in a lot of the Shadow Dark stuff. So if you go on the Shadow Dark Discord or Shadow Dark Facebook group or whatever, you can probably find me there too.
All righty. Thanks, folks, for listening to the Ron Talks Tabletop Podcast. And until next time, see you later.